AZ-305 Designing Microsoft Azure Infrastructure Solutions is a required exam for Microsoft Certified Azure Solutions Architect Expert Certification. Passert Team New Updated Azure Solutions Architect Expert AZ-305 dumps to help you study the latest exam content and practice real questions and answers to help you pass your Microsoft AZ-305 exam successfully. Question 1. You plan to migrate App 1 to Azure. The solution must meet the authentication and authorization requirements. Which type of endpoint should App 1 use to obtain an access token? A. Azure Instance Metadata Service, IMDS. B. Azure AD. C. Azure Service Management. D. Microsoft Identity Platform. Answer. D. Question 2. You need to recommend a data storage strategy for Web App 1. What should you include in the recommendation? A. An Azure SQL database elastic pool. B. A vCore-based Azure SQL database. C. An Azure virtual machine that runs SQL Server. D. A fixed-size DTU Azure SQL database. Answer. B. Question 3. You need to recommend a notification solution for the IT support distribution group. What should you include in the recommendation? A. Azure Network Watcher. B. An action group. C. A SendGrid account with advanced reporting. D. Azure AD Connect Health. Answer. D. Question 4. What should you include in the identity management strategy to support the planned changes? A. Move all the domain controllers from corp.fabricam.com to virtual networks in Azure. B. Deploy domain controllers for corp.fabricam.com to virtual networks in Azure. C. Deploy a new Azure AD tenant for the authentication of new R&D projects. D. Deploy domain controllers for the rd.fabricam.com forest to virtual networks in Azure. Answer. B. Question 5. You need to recommend a solution that meets the data requirements for App 1. What should you recommend deploying to each availability zone that contains an instance of App 1? A. An Azure Cosmos DB that uses multi-region writes. B. An Azure Storage account that uses GeoZone Redundant Storage, GZRS. C. An Azure Data Lake Store that uses GeoZone Redundant Storage, GZRS. D. An Azure SQL database that uses active geo-replication. Answer. A. Question 6. You need to recommend an app service architecture that meets the requirements for Apple. The solution must minimize costs. What should few recommend? A. One app service environment, ASE, per availability zone. B. One app service plan per availability zone. C. One app service plan per region. D. One app service environment, ASE, per region? Answer: A. Question 7. You need to recommend a solution to generate a monthly report of all the new Azure Resource Manager resource deployment in your subscription. What should you include in the recommendation? A. Azure Activity Log. B. Azure Monitor Action Groups. C. Azure Advisor. D. Azure Monitor Metrics. Answer: A. Question 8. You need to deploy resources to host a stateless web app in an Azure subscription. The solution must meet the following requirements. Provide access to the full .NET framework. Provide redundancy if an Azure region fails. Grant administrators access to the operating system to install custom application dependencies. Solution: you deploy a web app in an isolated app service plan. Does this meet the goal? A. Yes. B. No. Answer: B. Question 9. You have an on-premises network and an Azure subscription. The on-premises network has several branch offices. A branch office in Toronto contains a virtual machine named VM1 that is configured as a file server. Users access the shared files on VM1 from all the offices. You need to recommend a solution to ensure that the users can access the shares files as quickly as possible if the Toronto branch office is inaccessible. What should you include in the recommendation? A. A recovery services vault and Azure backup. B. An Azure file share and Azure file sync. C. Azure blob containers and Azure file sync. D. A recovery services vault and Windows Server backup. Answer: B. Question 10. You plan provision a high-performance computing HPC cluster in Azure that will use a third-party scheduler. You need to recommend a solution to provision and manage the HPC cluster node. What should you include in the recommendation? A. Azure Lighthouse. B. Azure Cycle Cloud. C. Azure Purview. D. Azure Automation. Answer: B.